So that leaves us today with a country which still doesn't have sovereignty, doesn't expect really to regain its sovereignty anytime soon, remains a proxy arena for conflict between Syria, Iran, and Israel, and to some degree indirectly the U.S., one in which there is sort of a two-state situation. Hezbollah essentially has its own state, and the Lebanese formal state has its own institutions as well. Environmentally, the only hope for Lebanon, and I'll come back to this at the end, effectively is a full peace treaty between Syria and Israel and a return of the Golan Heights. There's really effectively no way for Lebanon to extricate itself from this conflict except by moving forward to full peace. That's very unlikely. That doesn't look like it's going to happen, but that, to my mind, is the hard reality. A few words about Lebanon's politics. As you know, Lebanon's politics is communal, largely. That's summarizing a very complex reality, but that is one way to look at it. It's a government of communal power sharing, communal leadership and communal power sharing. And it's interesting just to step back and trace the communal politics of the main communities in the country. Look at the Shiite community, which historically, the 30s and 40s, started off as a fairly conservative, feudal sort of families controlling Shiite politics, moving into a period when leftist parties, communist parties, sort of very secular left, challenged the hold of traditional leaders in the Shiite community, transitioning through the 60s with the leadership of Imam Musa Sadr, sort of an early Iranian but a very specific version of that, way before the Islamic Revolution of Iran, but really the empowerment of the Shiite community in the 60s and 70s through the leadership of Imam Sadr, leading to the rise of Iran and the flooding of Iranian money, Iranian ideology, Iranian leadership, Iranian organization. The Shiite community, which in the 30s was one thing, in the 60s and 70s was something else, today has been pretty much taken over by an Iranian style, Iranian money, Iranian leadership, Iranian-inspired organization. That's where the community basically sits today. The Sunni community, a very interesting trajectory as well, also following sort of the fortunes of the community in the region. Started off in the 50s, or in the 50s, you go back that far, Jamal Abdel Nasser, Egyptian leadership, Arab nationalism, transitioning in the 70s, late 60s and 70s to the Palestinian Revolution, the PLO, Fatah, as an example of empowerment and so on. And as money and power shifted to the Gulf, so as well the Sunni community ended up also being fairly dominated, or very, very large influence for Saudi Arabia on the Sunni community. The current leadership very close to Saudi Arabia. So an interesting also trajectory how Lebanese communities follow power and influence among their communities. The Christian community, the other third sort of contemporary Lebanon, generally more divided community, but also its leaders have been fishing around for the past decades for some stable alliance. Of course, their historic alliance was in Europe, was through France and through Western powers. As that ebbed, they clung occasionally to U.S. In the 50s, the Eisenhower Doctrine, again just recently with the Bush administration. But the U.S. is a very distant power, so it comes and goes, and that alliance is not a stable one. But we've found Christian leaders in recent years sometimes allying with Israel, sometimes Saddam Hussein, sometimes Syria, sometimes Saudi Arabia, even most recently Iran. So the Christians really fishing around for an alliance, since they don't have a natural communal alliance, more desperately trying to find alliances that are reliable for them. Within that sort of context, between 1990 and 2003, which was the period of Syrian sort of control of the country, which was acquiesced to by most of the regional powers as well as essentially the Western powers, most Lebanese politicians, with the exception of Michel Aoun and a few others, had to accept and live with Syrian control of the country. And indeed they did. And the country lived sort of two projects. One was the Hezbollah project, backed by Syria and Iran, proxy army, resistance against Israeli occupation, pressure on Israel. And that project continued throughout the 90s and continues to this day. But at the same time, there was Rafiq Hariri, the project of rebuilding Lebanon, business, rebuilding Beirut, normalizing politics and economics in the country, which also had a lot of achievements. And those, oddly, those contradictory projects coexisted under Syrian management until about 2003. The real parting of the ways was 2003, 2004. U.S. and Syria disagree over Iraq. And you see these two alliances forming immediately in Lebanon. Alliances also form to reflect the shift in regional and international politics. The former Prime Minister Rafi al-Hariri leading a coalition fairly anti-Syrian, allied with Christian and Druze leaders, bringing them along in that direction to contest the 2005 elections. Hezbollah and others forming a coalition on the other side, as it were. And that division within the country, which was a very recent division in 2004, became crystallized and kind of, written in blood with the assassination of Rafi al-Hariri in February of 2005. That really split the communities and split politics in Lebanon along what became to be known as the March 14 and March 8 coalitions. Indeed, many in Lebanon, or some in Lebanon, expected, as I mentioned, that the U.S. surge into Iraq would continue to changes in Syria and Hezbollah and Iran and so on. And hence, some in March 14 were banking on sort of a full surge, as it were. As we all know, that did not happen. The attack on Hezbollah did not bear the fruit that Israel and the U.S. hoped it would. The situation in Iraq deteriorated. Iran seemed to be the main beneficiary of the U.S. project in Iraq and, in fact, in the Middle East. And Syria, so far escaping the snares of the International Tribunal and coming back politically in the Levant, has survived the storm and is actually back fairly effectively and powerfully in the region. This ebb of sort of the American surge, which I said took place around 2007 and 2008, was really crystallized in Lebanon in the events of May 2008, where clashes between March 14 and March 8 ended within hours with a victory for Hezbollah, clearly indicating that the balance of power had shifted and a new order had arrived. And indeed, the situation that emerged and has now sort of become normalized after the events of May 2008, the election of a consensus president, and the elections of 2009, followed by the current national coalition government, is a situation that resembles the status quo ante, the status quo before 2004, albeit with the very major difference that Syrian troops, the Syrian army, and visible Syrian intelligence offices are not present in Lebanon in the way they were, but indeed foreign policy and defense and security issues are once again, in a sense, being coordinated with Syria, and we can talk more about that later. Looking at sort of today and the road ahead, again, just remarks. The big picture is Lebanon's basic conundrum cannot be resolved without peace between Syria and Israel. That really is the bottom line. How that might happen, will it ever happen? If it happens, what would happen between Lebanon and Israel? What happens to Hezbollah? It's a very important, interesting discussion, but that really is the key to beginning to resolve Lebanon's problem with its environment.